In the past 3 years, we've been fortunate to see remakes of two classic games, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. And yes, despite its mixed reception, I'm still going to mention it. A few months back, Capcom announced that Resident Evil 4, even though not long ago it got ported once again, though this time to VR, that the game was set to have a remake. What puzzled me is that if we're going in chronological order of games, why was Code Veronica skipped over? Is it the black sheep of the franchise, or does Capcom have something planned for Code Veronica later on? Today, Ken Cole and I will be talking about why Code Veronica deserves a remake. Let's talk about the importance of the game in the Resident Evil storyline, Wesker's appearance in this game, Darkside Chronicles, and more. It should go without saying that there are spoilers ahead, so if you're unfamiliar with this game's storyline, go play the game first and then come back. Let's do a quick recap and a brief summary of what happens during the events of Resident Evil Code Veronica. Feel free to skip the recap, but be warned, you may miss some important details we discuss later on in the video. 3 months after the destruction of Raccoon City and the events of Resident Evil 3, Claire Redfield investigates an Umbrella facility in Paris while searching for her brother Chris Redfield, where she is caught and chased throughout the building. After nearly escaping, she is caught by Rodrigo Juan Raval and is sent to Rockford Island, where she is thrown into a cell. Not long after, the island is invaded, which results in a T-virus outbreak. As Claire is searching for a way to escape the island, she meets fellow inmate Steve Burnside and has repeated encounters with the owner of Rockford Island, Alfred Ashford. Claire discovers that Alfred has a twin sister, Alexia, who confronts her, but this is foiled by Steve, and it's revealed that Alfred was posing as his sister. The two eventually escape from the island after Claire defeats the tyrant twice, though the plane is rerouted automatically to Antarctica by Alfred, which is the location of another Umbrella facility run by him. However, this facility also has a T-virus outbreak, so Steve and Claire must escape once again. After another confrontation with Alfred, which leaves him mortally injured and destroying the monster Nosferatu, as a last resort, the real Alexia Ashford wakes up and with her new powers, destroys the vehicle Steve and Claire used to escape. Despite all hope being lost, it's revealed that the email Claire sent to Leon Kennedy, an RPD officer she met during the outbreak that occurred in Raccoon City 3 months prior, was able to get in contact with her brother Chris, who arrives at the ruins of the island not long after Claire and Steve escaped. Rodrigo informs Chris of Claire's escape, and while exploring through the military training facility, meets a ghost from his past, Albert Wesker. Wesker, now working for Umbrella's rival organization, led the HCF to invade the island, causing the outbreak, and even had an encounter with Claire earlier. Chris learns from Wesker that Claire is in the Antarctic and how he also plans to go there to capture Alexia Ashford. Chris manages to survive his encounter with Wesker thanks to Alexia distracting Albert, and eventually also flies to the Antarctica facility. Over the course of the game, it's revealed that the grandfather of Alexia and Alfred, Edward Ashford, was the founder of Umbrella, and his son, Alexander Ashford, created the twins through a surrogate mother using DNA from his ancestor, Veronica Ashford. Alexia would work with Umbrella starting at the age of 10, and 2 years later, with her brother, discover the origin of their creation. Alexander would turn into Nosferatu thanks to Alexia's new T Veronica virus that she created from the progenitor virus and a virus from a queen ant. The experiment goes wrong, and Alexia learns that in order to tap the full capabilities of the virus, she would need to place herself in cryogenic suspension for 15 years. Chris eventually finds Claire in a replica of the Spencer mansion, though the two are split up by Alexia. Claire manages to find Steve, who has also been injected with the T Veronica virus, and almost kills her, but regains his humanity at the last second, attacks Alexia, and as a result, is hit by Alexia in a counterattack, which leaves him with a mortal wound. Steve declares his love for Claire and succumbs to his injuries. Meanwhile, Chris witnesses a confrontation between Wesker and Alexia in her first form, and as they come to a stalemate, Chris is forced to fight Alexia thanks to Wesker. Chris manages to knock her out and finds Claire locked in the room where Steve is, who gives him the key card to unlock all the doors within the facility and to also start the self-destruction process of the base. Chris orders Claire to run and wait for him in the hangar, and after a grueling battle, destroys Alexia once and for all. However, it's revealed that Wesker manages to capture not only Claire, but also Steve's remains to secure a sample of the T Veronica virus. Wesker lets Claire go, and although putting up a fight, Chris is no match for Wesker. After dropping steel girders on Wesker, the two are separated by an explosion, and Wesker swears that he won't be lucky next time. Chris manages to reach the jet in time with Claire in it, and swears to his sister that he will stop Umbrella for good as they escape. And of course, to discuss one of my favorite games of all time, I have the legendary Ken Cole with me. Ken, thanks for joining me, man. How are you today?
Doing great, Strife. Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's gonna be very interesting because this, first time you and I have both done a video game collaboration, so I'm really excited, especially with a fellow Resident Evil fan who I didn't know until like we talked like one day when we are getting ready for one of the KinCasts. So very excited.
Oh, I'm excited too. I love Resident Evil and almost all of its forms, so it's great to be here.
So I think it's definitely important to talk about why the game is so important and why it needs a remake. This was the very first game that I played that ever got me into Resident Evil. So like most people have maybe started with 1, some of the newer generations might have started with 4 or 5, or even some like the newest generation might have started with, the most recent of 7 or 8. But for me, Code Veronica was the very first, and I just really liked it. It's the first game that, and really unless I'm mistaken by later titles, one of the only few games that you can play as both Redfields in the same game, in the actual story mode and whatnot. There's just something about the atmosphere of Code Veronica X that just kind of makes it really, really dark, because when you start off on Rockford Island, first start off in that prison cell and the prison area, and of course they have like, there's even like rooms full of torture, like there's even guillotines there. When you're going through the game and whatnot, whoever runs this island is very sadistic. And while we've kind of seen some of that tone in early Resident Evil games, obviously the secrets of the Spencer Mansion, and of course there's William Birkin's research, and then the waste of Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3. Something about the tone of this game just kind of hits a little bit differently. How'd you feel about this game when you first played it?
I really love this game. I thought it was excellent. I started actually, pretty much I played Remake first, then I backed up and I played 0, then Remake again, then 2, 3, then Code Veronica. So I played them kind of in story order. And even at that point, this was the 5th Resident Evil game I played, and it was just great, very entertaining. What do you do after everything that happened in Raccoon City and Resident Evil 2 and 3? And Code Veronica really answered that question very well. It goes epic. It takes us away from Raccoon City. It dives into the lore, behind the Umbrella organization. How did everyone come about to do this? It even resurrects, Wesker, which was an all-time favorite character for me. And just the innovations, like the advances sort of in the pre-rendered animation, cutscenes, the graphics at the time, it really pushed the series forward. And I almost thought of it as like it could be Resident Evil 3 if it wanted to be. Resident Evil 3 was a great game in and of itself, but it was almost like a half step, sort of like a half sequel, alternate viewpoint. Whereas this felt like the true next continuation of the Resident Evil saga. And I just thought they went epic, and it was great.
Definitely. As we've kind of talked about, we'll also talk about later on in this video as well, it just feels very weird that Capcom is specifically skipping over Code Veronica first to remake 4, which, don't get me wrong, I love 4. It's also one of my other favorite Resident Evil titles, especially because it changed the direction and how the gameplay. But I feel like it's almost like a sin to skip over Code Veronica, especially because they just put out the VR port release of Resident Evil 4 for Oculus. I feel like it's almost too sudden because, you're just kind of skipping over this integral part of the story and why it's so important. And as you mentioned before, the lore of Umbrella, Edward Ashford, the grandfather to the antagonists of the game, Alexia and Alfred Ashford, was one of the founders of Umbrella. That's kind of why, to me, this game is really important, because it dives deep into like, okay, what is the actual history behind Umbrella? Who started it? How deep does Umbrella go? Because as you said, it just goes beyond Raccoon City. Umbrella was just never just like, okay, everything's kind of just taking place around Raccoon City. It's essentially global at this point, especially when it kind of hints that the Ashfords kind of descend from England or United Kingdom, so to speak, or it almost implies that. It all just kind of ties back to Umbrella, and even the villains are great. Of course, the twist that like Alfred is impersonating his own sister because she's in a cryogenic state just kind of shows like how deep his issues are, and it's just something we hadn't really seen before. Like Resident Evil 2 Remake expanded upon that with Chief Irons, especially like giving a taste of that in the original Resident Evil 2. But Code Veronica just kind of like punches you right in the gut with everything that's wrong with the Ashford family and the dark secrets behind it, especially with, Alexander creating nearly Alfred and Alexia out of thin air. So I always thought that was like some more interesting aspects of why it's important, just like the tone it sets of why it deserves a remake.
Right. I totally agree. And going back and looking at the game now, obviously it was a game of its time. It was a really interesting relationship, very kind of like twisted relationship between Alexia and Alfred. But I think in a remake, that's a good opportunity to actually dive in and kind of do a little more nuance because, obviously everything was very blunt back then. I know that the game's been kind of accused of being a bit insensitive, because he kind of dresses as his sister. I think that's meant to be a nod to Psycho, but it sometimes comes across as a little insensitive. I think a remake would be a perfect time to really introduce some nuance into that relationship. It's so important to the story. And like you said, too, it's a pivotal chapter in the Resident Evil saga because it takes us from Raccoon City and everything that's happening with Raccoon City and makes it global. Really sets the stage for Resident Evil 4. And we start to see Wesker coming back in Resident Evil 4 in the background. Obviously, he's a huge character in Resident Evil 5. And it doesn't make sense without Code Veronica if you're playing through the saga. So I think they need to do Code Veronica. I really hope they do a remake of it. And there's so much, I would think that the developers would be licking their chops to do it because there's so much great material, so much great thematic material. I mean, you're in Antarctica, by the end. I mean, it's really epic. Really.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned too is like, the homage to like other pieces outside of video game media, like Psycho, for example. And when you mentioned Antarctica, one of the things that just crossed my mind was The Thing, that classic 80s movie, because, and it makes sense because you have a creature, if you were going to call it that, like Alexia, because she's, used the T Veronica virus within her system to transform her body over a very long period of time, and then she's awakened by her brother and of course technically Claire and Steve. So that's like another homage there. And then you could also even bring in their father that they experimented on, Alexander Ashford, who they've turned into Nosferatu because his body kind of rejected the T Veronica virus. So you have like that element there. It's just one of those games that it plays those subtleties and those nods to films just right. And I'm sure other Resident Evil games have done this as well. Resident Evil 1 was based off of an old Japanese movie and game called Sweet Home, which perhaps we could talk about that in a later video. But just the fact that it pays those homages and it just really tips those hats at the precursors so well. And one of the things we really can't forget about is the music. To me, the music is such a classic, especially not only in my opinion, but people I've heard that are also Resident Evil fans. One of their favorite themes of the save room comes from this game.
Oh, yeah.
And I personally think also that there's kind of some Terminator-inspired music, especially when you're in the military training facility, especially in the basement, and I think on the first floor as well. You kind of have like those synths and those droning strings that you would hear like in some of the Terminator films. Also, in the track Sub-Zero, which plays in Antarctica after you get all the electricity running. That's like another nice homage to like some earlier horror films, like especially when you think of the very first Terminator film, which was really more of a slasher compared to a sequel. So it just ties like all those tributes together so well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned this before, you have both Redfields in one game, which is special, and it really ties together what they've been going through, in Resident Evil 1 and 2, and you get to finally see them together in Code Veronica. And kind of get a nice love story for Claire. And if you're a fan of the character, this is really an essential game to play. Okay, Strife, we're talking about Code Veronica, and we need to talk about Wesker, because he is a pivotal character in this. He's been a pivotal character in the Resident Evil saga up to this point, and this is his return. The last time we saw him was in Resident Evil 1, and we thought he got killed. We thought he died in Resident Evil 1, but he's not dead. We see him again, and he's different this time. He has glowing eyes, he has superpowers, and he does not like Chris at all. So he's working for a rival organization, and it really kind of starts to set up this idea of this rivalry, this war that's going on beyond Umbrella. It's really kind of raising the stakes, making the story very epic. And also, he really seems to be a puppet master behind the scenes. This was the first game you played, so this was your first exposure to Wesker. How did he strike you when you first played the game, and how important do you think this character is to you now in the entire saga?
So I played Code Veronica X and not Code Veronica, but yeah, so that was the specific version that introduced him, like with all the extended cutscenes and whatnot. I thought he was just insane and like really cool too as a villain, just because he didn't really care who was in his way and he would just do whatever. At first, because again, this was the first Resident Evil game, I thought this was supposed to kind of tie into Street Fighter, because when he does that dash, it's almost like that same Ashura warp that Akuma does in Street Fighter. So I thought they were kind of tying it to that. Richard Waugh, I love his iteration of Wesker. DC Douglas did really great too in Resident Evil 5, don't get me wrong, but maybe it's just because I've heard Richard's voice first. To me, he's the definitive Wesker. And also his iteration is what DC Douglas based his voice off of when he did Wesker in Resident Evil 5. So he was just already iconic from the get-go, even without having played Resident Evil 1. His glowing eyes, and when Chris realizes he's not human, it was so epic. Even for someone like me that had never played any of the prior Resident Evil games yet at that point, it was such an epic introduction to me. And of course, his importance now, it all just kind of ties like so well together. Especially at the end of the Code Veronica, Wesker says, next time we're going to settle this. And if I'm not mistaken, that next time was in Resident Evil 5, where there's even more continuation of their rivalry, so to speak, where Chris just hates Wesker and vice versa. And Chris even has even more of a vendetta now because he assumed Wesker was responsible for Jill's death when they were going after Oswald Spencer. He's such an iconic character. Also interesting to note too is that some versions of Code Veronica X later came with a mockumentary produced by Capcom called Wesker's Report, which actually went into detail of how he survived the events of Resident Evil 1 all the way up until Resident Evil 3. And some interesting things to note here is how he survived the Tyrant's attack is that he introduced this virus into his system ahead of time from William Birkin, which allowed him to kind of fake his death. And for those of you that have played the Umbrella Chronicles, you kind of see this as he's escaping the mansion and eventually runs into Lisa Trevor. Not to mention, it also elaborates that during the events of Resident Evil 2, he and Ada are working together for the rival organization of Umbrella, which, you know, they kind of talked about a little bit in 4 behind the scenes during Separate Ways scenario in Resident Evil 4. But it's very interesting to note that even back then they were still working together. And as some of you guys that might have known this already, the rival organization's paramilitary wing, HCF or Hive Capture Force, is the force that invaded Rockford Island, which causes the outbreak. So he's just definitely a very important character, and in my opinion, one of, if not the most iconic villain of the Resident Evil franchise.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he's essential. And, you know, my other videos, I talk about Terry Silver. Like, Wesker is the Terry Silver of Resident Evil. What this game, I think, does so well with Wesker is it elevates him. In the first one, we didn't know he was a bad guy, you know, till part of the way through. Then he appeared to die, almost like a one-off type villain. This game changes that. This game makes him just a master of everything that's going on. He's rogue. He's got plans. You know, he wants to dominate the world. It really sets him up, I think, as this epic character. And really, that's why everyone needs to play Code Veronica to see that happen.
You know, we also can't not talk about Wesker and not talk about one of the most epic confrontations is when he fights Alexia in her Form 1, one-on-one, you know, just trying to take the fight to her. That also kind of attests to not only how strong Albert Wesker is, but how strong Alexia is after, you know, being asleep all those years, that the fact that she could take a punch from him, not stagger. And at the same token, Albert Wesker getting caught on fire, but waving his hands out, which, as you know, in that boss fight, if she grabs you once, you're dead.
Right. So
they just kind of like showed that they're basically like on equal footing at that point.
And that was, honestly, I have to say, that was like an amazing moment. They fight, and which was a great thing to see. It was so interesting to see what would happen when Wesker fights Alexia. Then he fights her, and then he's like, you know something, Chris? You know, you're one of my best guys. I'm going to let you finish this. And he just leaves. I mean, that's just so classic. It's like, I don't care. I'm going to move on. A classic, great character moment for Wesker.
And of course, at the end of the game, as we kind of talked about already, because the fact that he has Steve's body with him as he's holding Claire hostage, that's also what kind of helps him develop the Ouroboros virus as we see in Resident Evil 5, because that company that he works for eventually merges into Tricell in 2004 in the game's storyline. Another reason why this game deserves a remake, because even the events of this game still tie directly into games later on down the road, including Resident Evil 5.
Yeah, it's really the linchpin of like this entire Resident Evil 0 to 5 story arc. It's pretty incredible. Okay, so one thing I know I've heard before is that a lot of players seem to think that this game is difficult. Maybe it's because I'm more old school and I've played so many games, but I really didn't think of this as being massively more difficult than the other Resident Evil games. Or I didn't have the same trouble, I guess, that a lot of other players did. I know that's individual. I'm interested to hear what you think, Strife. Like, did you ever find this game overly difficult?
The first couple playthroughs, yes, but only because, again, this was my first Resident Evil game, and I've never had played like a horror survival game where that's focused on puzzles and things like that. I can understand why some people complain about the backtracking, but really you could also say that about For me, for example, Resident Evil 1, when I played and beat that game through the first time, the mansion, in my opinion, kind of seems more intimidating and overwhelming at first, just because there's so many rooms, and that's just the first area of the game. I can understand why some people don't like to backtrack, but like with any other Resident Evil games, if you learn it well enough, eventually it just becomes second nature to you, and you can kind of just run through the game just fine. That being said, I feel like they're very gracious with the health you have in this game. So, for example, again, talking about Resident Evil 1, Jill is more or less easy mode, where she gets better weapons up front first, more inventory slot, but she takes a little bit more damage, where compared to Chris, has a limited inventory, the weapons are kind of okay, but he takes damage fairly well. I feel like in this game, they evened it out for both Claire and Chris. Not to mention, in this game, I know it's a lot easier for me if a zombie starts a biting animation. If you're quick enough, you can actually cancel it to where he doesn't even bite you and you just shove the zombie off.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I really would consider this game that difficult, but then again, because this was my first Resident Evil game, the other games seem fairly simple to me. So that's my opinion.
You know, and I think that's a really great point, because at least for me at this point, this was the fifth one I had played. And I think with these Resident Evil games, at least the older ones, once you kind of figure out how the games think, you know, like how the puzzles unfold, what the quirks are in combat, that type of thing. Once you kind of get into that groove, I think it's a lot easier. And so I think you're right. It's like, if this is the first one you play, it's probably pretty hard. But if you've already played a bunch of these before, you kind of get it. You're in the groove. I think you're probably right about that.
The one thing that is a fair complaint about this game that I will agree with is that compared to other games, the Magnum is very weak. So, for example, you can only fire 6 shots at a time, and if you're using that on Alexia 2, for example, it takes a lot of those shots to get her into her second form. It's perfect if you're fighting Alexia 1, because it's like 2 shots and she's down. Compare that to another weapon in the game, the bowgun with explosive arrows. I could fire 15 of those in rapid succession at Alexia 2, and it immediately transforms her into Alexia 3. Mm-hmm. So unless you're fighting like a zombie or maybe even a hunter or whatnot, compared to like some other bosses, Magnum is not useful at all in this game, which is ironic because it's based off the Colt Python, which was Barry's Magnum in Resident Evil 1.
That is interesting. That's a really good point, actually, because we all look forward to getting the Magnum in Resident Evil. So yeah, that's interesting. They kind of made it not as effective.
And of course, when we're talking about Code Veronica and all these things of why it deserves a remake, we also can't forget about the innovations that the original versions did as well. This is the first game of the series to not have pre-rendered backgrounds. All of the backgrounds are 3D rendered, so that also results in the game looking a lot smoother. Not to mention, this was the first game on kind of the next generation of consoles. 1 through 3 all came out on PS1, with 2 being the exception of also having an N64 port. This was the first Resident Evil game to come out on the Dreamcast. If you were like me, you played Code Veronica X, you played it either on the PS2 or GameCube, so it already just overall looked very smoother compared to some of the blockier looks of the first 3 games in the series. And of course, it also brought back some of those great features from previous games as well. So the 180 turn is a lot smoother in this game, which was first introduced in Resident Evil 3. They also bring back the ability to shoot at oil drums and oil barrels, like you could do that in Resident Evil 3 as well. This is also the first game to allow you to have dual pistols. So, for example, like the M100Ps in this game, if there were 2 zombies in 2 different directions, you could actually aim and try to shoot both of them down at the same time. So I thought that was always a really neat feature as well. And of course, they also brought classic features back as upgradable handguns from Resident Evil 2 and side packs, which also helped expand your inventory. So there are 2 specific weapons in this game that allow you to fire from first-person mode, which is a sniper rifle that Alfred Ashford possesses that you can use in the battle against Nosferatu, and the linear launcher, which you use to kill Alexia with. This is also the game that allows you to play as 3 protagonists in one story setting, which was kind of neat. Again, both Redfields, and you play as Steve Burnside. And last but not least, while there was a battle game in the Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil 1, this one is more refined in my opinion, and it's very nice and very fun to play if you want to kill like a quick 15 to 20 minutes of your time to run through this game. The battle game is very fun because you can play as 2 versions of Claire. You can play as Chris, Steve, and also Wesker, and try to get lucky with that RNG to get the Magnum. And then, of course, what's also neat is they give you the option to play this battle game in first-person mode, like if you were to actually play a arcade shooter. What were some of your favorite innovations of this game, Ken?
Well, really, you touched on that innovation as far as like the new 3D rendered backgrounds, aside from the 2D pre-rendered backgrounds, that was really one of the first things that caught my eye, because that had been kind of a staple of the Resident Evil saga, was just the static pre-rendered backgrounds. And now you got a sense that we've moved forward in generations in gameplay. Was this going to work? You know, was this a risk? Are you destroying kind of like the horror, kind of like the feel of the game by doing 3D rendered backgrounds that actually had a little more freedom and movement? Would this give a new feel to the game that would make it feel less like Resident Evil? I thought they did a very elegant job of including that, and I thought it really worked. And it really felt like, in many ways, in all of these innovations, that they were taking those ideas from those first games and moving the series forward. It kind of felt like the future of Resident Evil. And I feel like sometimes it doesn't really get the credit for that it should. And maybe it's that because obviously the games are so much more advanced now, and you know, this kind of looks quaint in comparison, but it was a really big step at the time. And if I recall, Resident Evil 3 and Code Veronica came out at about the same time. Code Veronica obviously was just like an advance. You know, Resident Evil 3 was kind of carrying on that classic feel, like you said, wielding dual weapon. You're playing as Chris, Claire, Steve. All these things just made it feel a lot more epic in scope. And I thought they did just an amazing job at pushing the series forward technically. Okay, Strife, if we're talking about Code Veronica, we have to talk about Darkside Chronicles. And I don't know if everyone will remember this, but in the Wii era, with the Wiimote, there were these great on-rail light shooter games. And there were two of them. The first one was called the Umbrella Chronicles, and then that had a follow-up called the Darkside Chronicles. And these games actually, even though they were on-rail shooters, they explored the Resident Evil story from alternate vantage points. So by playing those games, you got story bits, you've got behind the scenes things you mentioned before about Wesker escaping, you know, in Resident Evil 1, that was in Umbrella Chronicles. Darkside Chronicles went sort of behind the scenes or looked at the story of Code Veronica in a different way. And you got some really interesting higher quality graphics. So it's almost like this was like a reimagining of Code Veronica graphically, and you got to see, wow, this looks so good, you know, which is another reason why I think we really need to see a remake, because we kind of got teases of that in Darkside Chronicles. Really amazing graphics, great voice acting, and it was a game that I really enjoyed. And Stripe, did you have a chance to play Darkside Chronicles at all?
I have not, but I want to in the future. I've always wanted to, just because the fact that it was kind of like the closest thing, even now, at the time that we had as a remake of Code Veronica. You know, the graphics are really nice. The fact that they even brought back some of the original voice actors. Of course, Allison Port, always classic as Claire Redfield. Even some of the nice redesigns, too, of how they made Steve as a monster, for example. They actually kind of made it like a legitimate boss fight with him now, compared to before, to where you just couldn't kill him at all. And then, of course, they even differentiated to where, instead of reusing the model for Alexia for both Alfred and the actual Alexia, in this game, they actually differentiated where Alfred was disguised as Alexia, and then in an actual Alexia model. Of course, we can't not talk about the amazing rendition that they did for the Alexia battle theme, played during the final battle, which, in my opinion, I didn't think it was possible to supersede the original, but they just did such an amazing remix specifically for that game.
Really a fantastic game. I really wish we'd get a re-release some sort for Darkside Chronicles and Umbrella Chronicles, but I think you're right. The whole game is just a wonderful tease for what they could do with a remake. So if anyone from Capcom is watching, we really want that remake of Code Veronica.
Please. Last but not least, one of the other things we have to talk about that's related to Code Veronica is the very obscure Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. For those of you that aren't aware, Resident Evil Survivor was a spin-off title that they did, which is very more similar to an arcade game like House of the Dead, for example. It was very first-person shooter. It did have some story elements to it, but it was specifically kind of like more like House of the Dead or Time Crisis, where you're just shooting first person and shooting at zombies and stuff like that. These games have never really been considered canon to the main storyline, and I could be wrong about the first one, but the reason why I bring this up is Survivor 2 Code Veronica actually retells some of the events of Code Veronica, but then at the end it's realized that Claire has been just dreaming this entire time after they've defeated Alexia and she and Chris are escaping from Antarctica. So what's really interesting is that this game actually existed as an arcade cabinet first of an actual like first-person shooter similar to Resident Evil Survivor, and where you can kind of like move around through like some of the same rooms, map layouts that they had from Code Veronica. But if you didn't get to the area that you needed to get to in time, you would actually run into Nemesis, which is very funny because, Chris and Claire have never encountered Nemesis before. It was Jill specifically in Resident Evil 3 that had a, recurring problem with Nemesis. So I thought it was just very interesting. Again, the game just kind of reiterates that this is a dream because Steve is present with her the whole time, even all the way up until like the end of the game fighting Alexia. So I always thought that was very interesting. What are your thoughts about this game? Have you ever played it? What do you think about the concept of it?
I've never played it. I love the concept. It's so interesting because we were just talking about Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles, and it seems to be this type of game that Capcom keeps coming back to with Resident Evil, the idea of, these light gun games. I'd love to play it. Again, it's like they've really gone back to this world so many times in interesting ways, in new ways, to really flesh out the stories and really build out this universe. And what a fun way to approach it, as in this game Survivor 2. I'd love to check it out. I'd love to play it.
And as you kind of mentioned before, it could be very possible that these games, specifically, Survivor 2, Code Veronica, and Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles, could get ported because there is a remake out for House of the Dead on PC. And from what I've seen, it looks very fun. Of course, House of the Dead is also a very classic horror franchise and survival game. It just looks so amazing and crisp in HD. So I'm hoping that, even if we had like an upscale of the Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles available for like either on Steam or Epic, I would love to play those personally, especially playing the games in this day and age while we wait for a remake of Code Veronica. So those are definitely worth mentioning. Maybe Capcom will also kind of follow that suggestion, make an AC remake of these games like they did with House of the Dead.
That would be fantastic. I'd love it. I assume it's going to be a number of years before Resident Evil 9. So there's a lot of time with a lot of potential Resident Evil content to remake and re-release. So I hope they do it. I know fans like us would lap it up.
Well, Ken, thanks for joining me. Always good to talk with another Resident Evil fan, especially somebody who sees the awesomeness of Code Veronica, as one would say. So I appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, Stripe. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Before I go, I want to give a quick shout out and thanks to my partners and affiliates. I now have official merchandise. Go to strifethewarrior.art or click on any of the merchandise below the comments section. If you're trying to prevent Wesker's team from stealing your data on T-Virus research, then you're going to need a VPN. Go to nordvpn.com/strifethewarrior or use coupon code strifethewarrior to get a NordVPN 2-year plan with a huge discount. You can use NordVPN to unlock Netflix and your favorite entertainment websites that are not available here in the US. You can connect up to 6 devices at the same time with one account. There's no data logging whatsoever, and it works even in China. NordVPN works with Windows, Mac OS, Linux, iOS, and Android, has a Chrome extension which is very user-friendly, and unlimited bandwidth. If you're not happy with it for any reason, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. With 7 awards won in 2021, it's no wonder why NordVPN is a winner. If you use this code, you also help directly support my channel. So go to nordvpn.com/strifethewarrior or use coupon code strifethewarrior at checkout. Last but not least, I'm sure I have a good majority of gamers in the audience. But did you know you can grab some excellent games while supporting charities at the same time? If you haven't already, you should check out HumbleBundle. They've raised over $200 million in charities since 2010 and feature a different charity site-wide every month. If you see a bundle you like, you can pay for what you want and in return get computer programs, games, ebooks, etc. and the proceeds support charity. Go to HumbleBundle.com and use my referral link in the description at checkout. As always, these referral links help support the channel, so thank you NordVPN and HumbleBundle. Let me know what you guys think down below. Does Code Veronica need a remake? If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like it, subscribe, share it with your friends, and comment, as these all help my channel grow. Be sure to check out and subscribe to my second gaming channel. I'm trying to get this channel to 1,000 subscribers, and supporting this channel also helps me support my main channel. I'll be uploading more clips to this gaming channel, so stay tuned for that. Keep up with me on my socials via Instagram and Twitter. Shout out to my YouTube members, I appreciate the support. If you'd like to directly support the channel, consider becoming a member and enjoy perks such as VIP channels access in Discord, preview videos before release, 15% off of merch, members only live streams and chats, and more, all for only 99 cents. Thanks for watching, stay beautiful, stay awesome, and we'll catch you around next time.